Welcome to this Rehabilitation Services Administration Technical Assistance Program on the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act Unified and Combined State Plan Submission. My name is Terry Martin, and I'm joined by my colleagues here in the Rehabilitation Services Administration State Monitoring and Program Improvement Division, Jim Doyle, Shannon Moeller, and April Trice. Our agenda for the second series program on the state plan submission, today we will examine and look at carefully the requirements of the Vocational Rehabilitation Services portion of the Unified and Combined State Plans, descriptions A through I. The following will provide an overview of the content requirements of each description comprising the State Vocational Rehabilitation State Plan that must be updated annually or amended as appropriate when material changes are made to the nature and scope of the vocational rehabilitation and supported employment programs described therein. In addition to a brief overview of the content requirements, Rehabilitation Services Administration provides guidance to assist vocational rehabilitation agencies to improve the accuracy, quality, and relevance of the information contained in the state plan. However, the guidance is not exhaustive, nor does it constitute a precise formula for developing an approvable state plan. Vocational rehabilitation agencies should request specific guidance not addressed in this training from their Rehabilitation Services Administration State Liaison or by sending an email to rsaquestions@ed.gov. Jason?
Thank you, Terry. Description A, input of the State Rehabilitation Council. If the VR agency has established a State Rehabilitation Council, SRC, the VR agency must include within the state plan a summary of the input provided by the SRC. In accordance with 34 CFR 361.16A25, the summary of input provided by the SRC is to include recommendations from the SRC's annual report, a review and analysis developed by the SRC of customer satisfaction, and information and other reports prepared by the SRC. This description must include the VR agency's response to the input and recommendations made by the SRC. And if the VR agency rejects any of the input or recommendation, it is required to provide explanation of its decision. Important points to consider when developing this description. This description is not required if the agency is an independent commission. Does the description include information that indicates that the VR agency and the SRC have jointly developed, agreed to, and reviewed annually its goals and priorities? Does the description include information that indicates the VR agency regularly consults with the SRC in the development, implementation, and revision of its policies and procedures pertaining to the provision of VR services? Does the description include information that indicates the VR agency is providing the SRC with plans, reports, and other information required to submit to RSA, policies and procedures used by the agency, personnel and the provision of VR services, and copies of due process and hearing decisions? Does the description include that the SRC has the opportunity to review and comment on the development of plans, policies, procedures related to the VR agency comprehensive system of personnel development? These points of collaboration, interaction, and exchange of information between the VR agency and the SRC provide an opportunity for the SRC to develop input and recommendations on the administration of the VR program and should serve as a source of the content to be included in Description A. Note that although statutory requirements updates are reported every 4-year submission and every 2-year modification of the state plan, VR agencies must gather and analyze the data on an annual basis. Description B, request for waiver of statewideness. RSA must approve a waiver of statewideness prior to the VR agency initiation of a service when the VR service is not available in all subdivisions of the state. This description must also include all waivers previously approved that are still in effect. Prior to the VR agency requesting a waiver, The following requirements must be met and should be clearly documented in this description. The non-federal share for the cost of services is provided by a local public agency, which may be contributed to the local public agency by a private agency or organization or individual. And the services are expected to lead to the contribution to the VR program of a larger number of individuals with disabilities or individuals with specific types of disabilities. If these requirements are satisfied, a VR agency must request a waiver of statewide-ness by including the following information in description B. A description of the type of services to be provided. The description should be detailed as possible for states requesting a waiver or including a prior approval waiver and still in effect. Make sure the description is detailed as possible. For instance, rather than simply stating that the project will provide pre-employment transition services, it must identify a specific service that will be provided to students with disabilities, such as work-based learning experiences. Also, must include assurances from the local and public agency that it will make available to the VR agency the non-federal share of funds, assurance that the VR agency will approve each proposed service prior to the implementation, and an assurance that all other state plan requirements will be applied to the services or project for which the waiver is being requested, including the agency's order selection requirements when appropriate. Note that the VR agency is requesting a waiver of statewide-ness, it must indicate yes in assurance 3G.
Description C, cooperative agreements with agencies not carrying out activities under the statewide workforce development system. In accordance with the Rehabilitation Act and 34 CFR 361.23 of the VR regulations, the VR agency should not include any program carrying out activities in connection with the statewide workforce investment system. However, examples of coordination or cooperation with other agencies that could be described within this description may include, but are not limited to the following: federal, state, and local agencies and programs, state programs carried out under Section 4 of the Assistive Technology Act of 1988, programs carried out by the Undersecretary of the Department of Agriculture for Rural Development, non-educational agencies serving out-of-school youth, any state youth contracts used by the VR agency, coordination or cooperative agreements with the statewide Independent Living Council or Centers for Independent Living, and cooperative agreements with recipients of American Indian Vocational Rehabilitation Service projects throughout the state to ensure shared resources and information, coordinated services, and collaboration of activities. Description D, coordination with education officials. Consistent with the requirements of the formal interagency agreement between the VR agency and the SEA pursuant to 34 CFR 361.22b, this description must describe, at a minimum, the following information: consultation and technical assistance, which may be provided using alternative means for meeting participation, such as video conferences and conference calls, to assist educational agencies in planning for the transition of students with disabilities from school to post-school activities, including pre-employment transition services and other vocational rehabilitation services. Transition planning by personnel of the designated state agency and educational agency personnel for students with disabilities that facilitates the development and implementation of their individualized education programs under Section 614D of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The roles and responsibilities, including financial responsibilities of each agency, including provisions for determining state lead agencies and qualified personnel responsible for transition services and pre-employment transition services. Procedures for outreach to and identification of students with disabilities who need transition services and pre-employment transition services. Outreach to these students should occur as early as possible during the transition planning process and must include, at a minimum, a description of the purpose of the vocational rehabilitation program, eligibility requirements, application procedures, and scope of services that may be provided to eligible individuals. Coordination is necessary to satisfy documentation requirements set forth in 34 CFR Part 397 regarding students with youth with disabilities who are seeking sub-minimum wage employment, and assurance that in accordance with 34 CFR 397.31, neither the state educational agency nor the local educational agency will enter into contract or other arrangement with an entity as defined in 34 CFR 397.5D for the purpose of operating a program under which a youth with a disability is engaged in work compensated at sub-minimum wage. Description E, cooperative agreements with private nonprofit organizations. In accordance with the Rehabilitation Act and 34 CFR 361.31 of the VR regulation, important points to consider when developing this description. The VR agency should describe the process in which cooperative agreements with private nonprofit VR providers will be established. The description should also include information related to the services provided under each agreement, as well as the way the agreement will improve outcomes for individuals with disabilities. And last, the description should be updated when content has changed from the prior state plan.
Description F, arrangements and cooperative agreements for the provision of supported employment services. Sections 101A and 606B of the Rehabilitation Act, as amended by WIOA, and 34 CFR sections 363.11E of the VR regulations require that the VR agency include a clear description under Description F of the VR portions of the state plan, its efforts to identify and make arrangements for the provision of supported employment services, including entering into cooperative agreements with other state agencies and other entities that will assist with the provision of supported employment services, and other public or nonprofit agencies or organizations within the state, employers, natural supports, and other entities for the provision of extended services for individuals with the most significant disabilities, including youth with the most significant disabilities. Description F should be updated when the content has changed from the prior state plan. It must reflect the current administration of the VR agency. Description G, coordination with employers. Description G is a requirement added to the VR portion of the state plan following the amendments of the Rehabilitation Act by the Workforce and Opportunities and Innovation Act in 2014. Section 101A11E of the Rehabilitation Act and 34 CFR Section 361.24C require VR agencies to describe efforts to develop competitive integrated employment and career opportunities necessary to facilitate the provision of vocational rehabilitation services and transition services, including pre-employment transition services for students and youth with disabilities. VR agencies should include a description of its coordination with employers, include its efforts through its job developers and employment specialists and the coordination with one partners, but also include efforts that demonstrate the VR agency working directly with employers across the state with the goal of developing competitive, integrated employment and career exploration opportunities. Description G must be updated as necessary to reflect the current administration of the VR agency. Description H, interagency cooperations. Section 101A11K of the Rehabilitation Act was amended by WIOA and 34 CFR Section 361.24G require VR agencies to describe how the agency will collaborate with state agencies responsible for the administration of programs that serve individuals with significant and the most significant disabilities to develop opportunities for competitive integrated employment. The description must include the collaboration with state agencies responsible for administrating the state Medicaid plan under Title 19 of the Social Security Act, providing services for individuals with developmental disabilities, and mental health services in the state. The description should include how the VR agency will work with each state agency to develop community-based employment in integrated settings to the greatest extent possible. This description should be updated as necessary to reflect the current administration of the agency.
Description I, comprehensive system of personnel development, data system on personnel and personnel development. The Rehabilitation Act and 34 CFR 361.18 of the VR regulations require VR agencies to describe its plan for recruitment, preparation, and retention of qualified personnel. When developing this description, VR agencies must ensure it includes accurate, up-to-date data on the number of staff employed by personnel category and the number of staff needed to provide VR services. Ensure it includes a projection of who will be needed by the agency within the next 5 years to provide VR services, including pre-employment transition services and the number of staff expected to retire or leave. Ensure that the agency has a plan to address current and projected needs, including recruitment, retention, and succession planning, and ensure the description includes how the agency plans on developing staff, including policies and procedures for the establishment and maintenance of personnel standards to train and prepare staff. The agency must also describe policies and procedures for the establishment and maintenance of personnel standards consistent with Section 101A7B of the Rehabilitation Act to ensure that designated state unit professional and paraprofessional personnel are adequately trained and prepared. Points that must be considered when developing the policies and procedures for the establishment and maintenance of personnel standards include: the description includes standards that are consistent with state requirements, and does the description include the establishment and maintenance of education and experience requirements to ensure all staff have a 21st century understanding of the evolving labor force and needs of individuals with disabilities. Additionally, VR agencies must consider if the description includes the VR agency's policies, procedures, and activities to ensure that all professional and paraprofessional personnel employed by the agency receive appropriate and adequate training in terms of a system of staff development related to assessment, vocational counseling, job placement, and rehabilitation technology, including training implemented under Section 4 of the Assistive Technology Act. Although these statutorily required updates are reported with every 4-year submission into your modification of the state plan, VR agencies must also gather and analyze this data on an annual basis.
Thank you, Shannon. That completes the second in our series of programs devoted to the submission of the vocational rehabilitation portion of the WIOA state plan for 2020. We invite you to join us for the next series in this program. And should you have any questions, please send those questions to rsaquestions@ed.gov. And it would be helpful if you noted in the subject line that they're regarding the state plan.